Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thanks for your patience. My name is Michael Washburn, and I'm Director of Programs at Humanities New York, which is the host of tonight's event. Humanities New York is an independent 501c3, but we're also the state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And the mission of Humanities New York is to strengthen civil society and the bonds of community, using the humanities to foster engaged inquiry and dialogue around social and cultural concerns. So, what does that mean? We at Humanities New York don't think of the humanities as a set of discrete disciplines, philosophy, art, history, literature, etc. Or in addition to thinking of them that way, we also think of the humanities as a set of tools for engaging and helping ameliorate some of the problems of social and civic life. And the most basic of these tools should be ubiquitous, but they remain difficult to encourage. Open, frank, and substantive dialogue about the hopes, anxieties, obstacles that unite and divide us. These practices support our best institutions of informal democracy, which we at the organization believe are key to a healthy American society. And this type of conversation, structured and informed, yet supple and nimble enough to respond to the opinions and experiences of participants, is a strength of the public humanities. We encourage this type of engagement not only through events like this, which we host several times a year in New York City as well as around the state, but through our grant making, we're a grant maker, and also through such programs as community conversations, reading and discussion, and public scholars. You can find information about all these programs at the check-in table if you'd like some propaganda about us. All of these offerings strive to help New Yorkers form and articulate their ideas and beliefs, develop critical thinking, analysis, synthesis, and problem-solving skills, and help us talk about and understand the ideas that define us as individuals and connect us to our communities. Through our work, we strive to show how the humanities remain vital to both personal development and civic discourse, which brings me to tonight's event. The title of tonight's event is Reflections on Liberation, American Civil Rights Past, Present, and Future. And normally this is where the person playing my part at the podium would give an apt statistic or tell an anecdote to kind of frame the discussion about why it's relevant. But we all know why we're here, right? I mean, we don't need to cue that up in any certain way. I'll say that what provoked the staff of Humanities New York to organize this event was one kind of idea that's quite uncomfortable for a lot of people, and that's just that the history of America can't be separated from the history of American racism. Same with the present, probably same in the future, unfortunately. And that said, from our perspective, if there's any hope of recovering or creating for the first time sort of broad civic trust amongst the many residents of this country, it'll require frank conversations that grapple with this history and sincere engagement with the present. Now, that having been said, I'm not sure if everyone in the room, both out there and up here, is going to agree that more talk is the answer, but that's sort of our perspective. We'll probably hear something more about that tonight. I mentioned the programs we run at Humanities New York, and one very important thing about how we practice the public humanities at the organization is that it isn't top-down. We aren't here solely to have our panelists drop knowledge on you. This is about dialogue, which we're going to get into in a couple of ways tonight. You're going to be a big part of the conversation. In order to draw on the expertise both on the stage and in the room, we're going to structure this evening differently than a standard panel discussion. The presentation part will be broken down into 3 sections, each followed by a Q&A. So first, we're going to discuss the history of American struggles for justice and equality. Pardon me. Second, we'll look at the present moment. That will be where most of the emphasis of the evening will lie. And then lastly, we'll look toward the future, what we can and cannot expect down the road a bit. After each of these sections, we'll have an audience Q&A of about 15 minutes, give or take. Since we don't have a lot of time, please be brief in your questions, keep them to 30 seconds or less. There'll be 2 microphones in the room moving around. So if you raise your hand, our moderator, Deva will call on you. You'll get the microphone and answer your question. So 3 different sets of issues, 3 different Q&As. And then finally, and I'm almost out of your way, we're going to start with something right now for you all. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like you to turn to your neighbor, ideally the one that's next to you that you don't actually know, and talk to them for 2 minutes, right? And here's the question that I want you to address to the stranger sitting next to you. What about the topic of tonight's event is important to you? Why do you think it's important that we're all here? So think about that for a second. You're going to talk about it for 2 minutes, and you're not going to have to report out. I'm not going to tag anyone. No one's going to have to speak. You're just going to talk to your neighbor for a second. 2 minutes. All right, folks. Thank you so much. I hope you had a good chat, a good abbreviated chat with your neighbor. My last bit of business is to introduce our moderator for the evening, Deva Woodley, who's to my immediate left. Deva's assistant professor of politics at the New School, and she's the author of The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. And she's currently working on a new book, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. And I should also say that there are books available right there in the little door past the entranceway. So thank you so much. Deva will introduce the rest of the panel. Enjoy the conversation. Deva Woodley.
Hello. Hi. I'm so glad you all are here, and I'm especially glad to welcome this panel, which is basically my dream panel. Really, Michael Washburn and the Humanities New York were like, we want to put together something where we're talking about the current moment, not only specifically, in terms of politics, but in terms of what seems like the zeitgeist that is happening now, where we're considering what the new century will look like. And I said, well, I have a couple people in mind that we should be talking to. And so let me introduce the panel. First, I have directly here to my left, Dr. Ibram Kendi, who is a professor of history and is the author of several books, the most recent of which is the wonderful book called 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction winner, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Right next to Dr. Kendi, we have Dr. Brittney Cooper, who is Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University, and she is the author of several books, actually 3 books that came out this year. Talk about being on your grind, each of which is special in its own way. Including a collaborative volume of Crunk Feminist Collective, which is a blog that I've been reading for years, the book Beyond Respectability, which is a book that is a more sort of a book that shows us the sort of the history of African-American feminist political thought, and then also her book Eloquent Rage, which is the most recent. A Black feminist discovers her superpower, right? So get into all of that with Dr. Brittney Cooper. Next to Dr. Cooper is Alexandra Bell, who was my classmate at the University of Chicago, and is both a professional communications person and a renowned artist who does amazing work in terms of changing the way that we see our public discourse narratives, right? So you may have seen Alexandra's work all around Brooklyn, and most recently you can see her work on exhibit at the MoMA, recently extended until what date, Alex? Until December 4th, so also get into that. Next to Alexandra Bell is Key Williams, who I have actually just met recently, who is an organizer in residence at Civic Hall, and also a key organizer with Black Lives Matter NYC. And I met Key on another panel, actually, and was so moved by the transformative nature of her eloquence and vision that I knew that she would be the perfect person to be in dialogue with the rest of us here. Yes. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Key's gender pronouns are he and they, and so I have made a mistake, and I will not do it again. Okay, so Key is going to talk to us here about issues like that, right? About how we need to transform the ways that we are relating to other people, and dealing with movement for liberations for the future, including not only race, but also in terms of gender nonconformity, and thinking in new ways. Okay? All right. Okay, so now that we have introduced the panel, I want to get on to our conversation. As Michael told us here, we are doing this conversation in 3 parts. And in the first part, I want to ask this opening question. And it is for all of the members of our panel, because I believe that everybody here will have something to say about it. But of course, I'm particularly interested in what our historians and intellectual historians have to say. So the first question is this. Right now, we are in a movement, or we are in a moment where there's an ascendant social movement, the movement for Black Lives, but there's also a lot of political organizing going on across the political spectrum. We're in a moment where people have sort of reawakened to the idea of citizenship and what they can do in order to contribute to the governance of their own selves. So in terms of thinking about liberation, thinking about what it means to forward the cause of freedom, I want to ask our panel, most Black people, activists and scholars understand that it's impossible to accurately describe the genesis of the American project, right, of America as a nation, culturally and politically, without understanding how racism, specifically white supremacy and anti-Blackness, has shaped the country in both social mores and law. However, the popular narrative of America's trajectory posits racism as a flaw that can be separated, excised from the more benevolent whole. This is not an easy perception to dislodge. Most people really like the progress narrative, right? Not only that things have progressed, but that actually progress is somehow inevitable. And many of us have reawakened to the fact that actually that's not necessarily the case. Regression may be as likely as progress. So how can those interested in liberation, in change, both personal transformative change, right, changing the way we speak and the way we think, as I have had to do tonight and publicly, right, but also political change, how that change can happen, right? What can we do in terms of what we say and how we say it that can correct the popular understanding that I think that many of us would say is fundamentally incorrect? Further, how do you think a changed understanding of the American project would impact American politics as it plays out today? Go ahead, Brittney.
Really? Good evening, everybody. Good evening.
Yeah.
I'm going to get this call and response thing right. Okay, so, Deva, you asked us to think about sort of if we could periodize or if there were key moments that we could sort of look at to think about this. And so, in thinking about that question, I want to point to 2 moments that might seem a bit disparate. I want to point to 1892 and 1992. So in 1892, a few key things happened in the U.S., really in the period of 1892 to 1893. So the first is that the U.S. was celebrating 400 years of Columbusing indigenous peoples' land. And then part of that is that they celebrated it as part of the Chicago World's Fair, which actually happens in the spring of 1893, but it's this 400-year celebration. And at the Chicago World's Fair, 6 Black women, I won't name them all, but 2 of them are Anna Julia Cooper and Fannie Burial Williams, come to the fore and they begin to advocate in the U.S. for the U.S. to pay attention to Black women. And it's the first time that we see any Black women have that level of public presence. They are there among hundreds of people, other women, articulating Black women's experience and talking about issues of employment, issues of sexual exploitation, issues of sexism and issues of racism and how they affect Black women. Also in 1892, Homer Plessy gets on a train in Louisiana and tries to sit in the white section and it doesn't work out. And we get the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which happens in 1896, but 1892 is when the actual incident occurs, right? And so the other thing that's happening in the broad spectrum is that 1892, because of the Plessy incident, tells us that this is when the end of Reconstruction is sort of set, right? That basically, even though we had enjoyed a period at the end of the Civil War where black people could vote, black people could hold office, as soon as Northerners got tired of beefing with their Southern brethren, they pulled out and left black people at the mercy of white people. And so then white people in the South, angry white Southerners, immediately began the rollback of all of these civil rights protections. And we see that that project is really complete by the early 1890s. So I point to that moment for one reason. Because in the same moment that you have black women coming forward saying, we can be a better version of America, you also have America saying, we're going to actually be the worst version of ourselves. We're going to take rights away from you as a way to shore up our own power, right? Fast forward 100 years. Lots happens in between 1892 and 1992. But 1992, I've been thinking about this moment because I heard a famous black feminist theorist named Kimberly Crenshaw talking about 1992 recently. So in 1991, Anita Hill accuses Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, of sexual harassment. And in the course of that, your beloved Uncle Joe Biden creates a situation in which Clarence Thomas is ultimately going to be confirmed to the Supreme Court. He suppresses the right of other women to testify against Clarence Thomas, and he sets up a bunch of white men to mock Anita Hill, and to say that she's a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty, right? That's like the narrative about Anita Hill. And so in 1992, so you get Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court. You then in 92 get Bill Clinton on the scene running for president. And you get women taking over, you get the year of the woman. Women, we have more women elected to Congress that year than we'd had at any previous time. I point to this moment because if we think about, and these scholars have pointed to this moment, if we think about what happens in that period, it sets us up for this period, right? In the sense that Clarence Thomas, we don't listen to a black woman saying, this man harassed me. White men and black men get together in a patriarchal brotherhood and put him on the court, and he has helped be the deciding vote in the rollback of voting rights, in the rollback of affirmative action, in the rollback of all of the gains that we saw in the 20th century. And so now we're in a moment where the Supreme Court looks the way it does because of decisions that were made 25 years ago. Right? When we chose not to listen to a woman saying that the prelude to sexual violence is often a prelude to all kinds of other violence. So I want to point to those two moments as a way to tell us that the other thing that typically happens is that you often see big leaps in social progress at the same time that you see the U.S. double down in its social structure in ways that will kill us for generations. Right? So you get more women in Congress, but then you put a man on the Supreme Court that can undo it. So it doesn't matter if you get more representation if you don't play the long game. And so this is a continual problem that we have, that our notions of progress are never inevitable, and that at any moment in time that you look and you see that we seem to be doing the right thing, there is always this sort of American id that is deeply engaged in self-sabotage and doesn't want to be its best self. And so I would point to those iconic moments as a way for us to think. They don't tell a completely neat story. It's a messy story, right? And so if you're looking for a neat narrative about where we went wrong, what I would say is that the thing about America is that we do right and then we do wrong over and over and over again. But what we should always be mindful of is that our wrongs, if we look historically, far outpace our rights. And that's the hard truth. And that for some of us, the last thing I want to say about this is for some of us, for white people, let me be really explicit. For white people, there's a challenge in believing that. For white people, the belief is that, we get it right. We just got it wrong sometimes and we can correct. But for those of us who are not right, what we see is that most of the time America is wrong, and that what we look for and what we hope for is those moments when we get it right. Because when we get it right, we get it really right. When we get it wrong, we get it really fucking wrong. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. It's truly an honor to be on this panel, and I think to extend Brittney's analysis and historiography a little bit, what she is referring to is this sort of dual history, this history of progress that is undeniable because of the efforts of some of the Black women activists she mentioned, because of the efforts of other activists throughout history. But then there's also been racist progress. And if we are sort of compounded as a country with notions of the inferiority of people of color, then when policies are progressing and those policies are discriminating against people and people disparities are persisting, we're assuming that those persisting disparities are the result of what's wrong with those people, as opposed to the progression of those policies, as opposed to American ugliness, as Brittney described. And I think one of the ways we can think about this sort of dual history is to understand really the dual nature of America. So America likes to talk about itself as the land of the, what? The free. So this notion of freedom. And I think most powerless people understand freedom in a different way than powerful people understand freedom. And so when power thinks about freedom, they're thinking about freedom to exploit, freedom to oppress, freedom to rape, freedom to harass, and any reduction in their ability to do those things they consider to be a reduction in their freedom. And so we have long had a history of people controlling this country who have tried to institute policies and maintain policies, and we certainly have a president now who wants untapped freedom to be able to do all those things, right? And then you have another force who is striving for freedom against those things. I want freedom from slavery, freedom from oppression, freedom from harassment. And so I think we need to sort of think about freedom in a dual sense, because really America, that's the way in which it's been able to attract both the oppressed and the oppressor to notions of freedom, because they think about those notions differently. And then finally, in the sense of equality, I think in a similar sense, we have to understand that there are also two ways to understand equality. And so even the notion of created equal, Jefferson, who expressed that all men were created equal, did not necessarily believe at the time that Black people were equal. And what I mean by that is you can believe that, that groups are created equal, but that doesn't necessarily mean you believe groups are equal. There's a difference. And so when you believe, so there's a certain group of people in this country who believe that they're certainly not inferior, and there's another group of people who think that, oh, we can make them equal one day by civilizing them or incarcerating them. And so I just wanted to express that. And the way that those three concepts work with this dual history, dual notion of freedom, and even dual notion of equality is, you know, our movement, the movement that I think we're going to be speaking about tonight, has not been the only movement. And so there's been another movement, and this is the movement of ugliness that I think Brittney was talking about. And so if we're not aware of that other movement based on that other notion of freedom and that other notion of equality, based on that other notion of America, and we just think that these policies or these bad things are sort of stale and that they're not going to get even more sophisticated, even more harmful, then we're not going to basically guard against that or even strive against that, because we're going to think that what we're fighting against is not actually progressing in that moment, right? And so we have to sort of understand that, you know, as we understand, I think, the present and even the future.
Absolutely.
Can you restate the first question you asked about them being linked, about being able to parcel out kind of racism?
So what I want to think about is how we talk about the idea that America as a project is not only or primarily a benevolent project that has sometimes gone wrong. but instead that in the very instantiation of the nation is the idea of white supremacy. And how do we talk about that? How do we sort of convey that against the popular narrative, right, as a way to think about how to move towards something like liberation?
Yeah. I'm the visual artist on the panel, so a big part of what I've been invested in recently is that I think that we've kind of, in some ways, exhausted ways of talking about it, right? We can kind of talk about racism is in the DNA of every structure in America until we're blue in the face, right? And somebody will try to pull that out and say, no, it's not really about race. It's about these other things, and these things happen without race being part of them, right? And so I think, you know, you can state that and you can kind of argue that, and then there's certain ways that you can show it. And so the work that I've been doing as part of a series that I've been calling Counter Narratives is kind of looking at the lineage of racism in journalism, right? And so if you point to these particular periods, typically you can also kind of pull up reportage during that time that shows kind of how we've moved through, you know, journalism. The goal of it was to kind of, you know, you said, did you say racism is about self-interest in a way? Did you say that, Ibram, is that your?
Oh, of course. Definitely.
Of course, right? And so you think, you know, when journalism began at kind of the beginning of time in the US, I mean, a good portion of the population, they were slaves. They weren't being interviewed. They weren't part of these articles, right? Journalism that was being produced was just to service a particular need. And so the work that I do where I kind of reimagine New York Times articles is I'm looking for the kind of the particles that are left over from that racist history, right? How can we talk about when newspapers were invented, the classified sections were really kind of either how you could buy a slave, you could search for a slave that had escaped, or you could sell one, right? I usually, when I give a talk, kind of walk through a series of slides that go from kind of early 1800s up until pretty much Mike Brown, right? Where you can kind of see this evolution or not evolution of particular terms. You can move from, you know, the 1800s of the guy was selling 400 slaves, right? He was looking to sell 400 slaves to 1941, I want to say I think it's Life piece where they try to walk you through distinguishing the difference between, they say Jap and a Chinese, right? This is kind of post-Pearl Harbor to kind of 1994, the darkening of O.J. Simpson's face to, you know, if we want to talk about the 90s and kind of Anita Hill, we can also kind of just dial back a couple of years and think about the Central Park Five. And if we go back to 1937, you can actually find literally almost the same language to describe the Scottsboro Boys, right? So how can we follow that lineage, right? And I think usually the best way to do that is a visual project. If you can kind of walk people through these examples and kind of say C, and kind of there's a through line there, I think that's an important way for us to think critically about how you can't actually extract that, right? It's in the DNA. Even of our kind of most revered, you know, publications, you can see these things, right? You can look and you can pick them out. I have this work where I actually insert white American into the title, and people think that the newspapers would never do that. And I'm like, no, they would never do that. We don't identify whiteness as a race, right? I'm intentionally kind of racializing people, right? And there's some shock and horror to that because we are all, or most people, right? I don't believe it's possible, are waiting for this kind of post-racial society. There's going to be a place where we go, where we're like in the skeeches and the snitches, where we're all just kind of mixed up and we don't know who's who. And I don't actually believe that. I think it's complete bullshit, right? And so one of the reasons that I do that is because it does kind of get you to look differently at people who actually operate very invisibly. Like white people are there, but you don't really see them, right? And so, and part of that emerged from a study that I read about in the 40s where this guy was trying to figure out how do we assign race, right? How are we identifying people in newsprint, right? And so he did this study about a month's worth of a paper. I really wish I could remember exactly which paper it was, but and he wants to see when we mention race in headlines. And so over the course of the 30 days, he finds that there are 39 articles that talk about crimes committed by black people. And in 36 of those articles, Negro is in the headline. And so then he finds that during that same 30 days, there are 131 articles that talk about either white people involved in court cases or white people involved in crimes. 0. No mention of race, right? And so I'm really interested in kind of how you can see that now. Like how does someone get the term American? How does someone get another kind of coded word, right? And so for me, that's how I try to talk to people about how race persists and how you can't actually remove it in this way, right? It's a stain.
You want to show, don't tell.
Yeah, you want to show. I feel like it's a good thing to show.
Key?
Thank you so much for inviting me to the panel. And,
Thank you. Sorry.
And then to be up here with such a lovely and intellectual and blessed company. I feel like to be really blessed to be in this company. The second part of the question is kind of what I want to touch on as far as anti-Blackness, right? Because we have used the word racism, but there's a really intentional point in America to be anti-Black, right? And so even if we were to say like anti-Blackness is a flaw, it's a 400-year flaw. Right, so even within the systems today, our systems are still based on anti-Blackness. Specifically, even in New York City, I'm part of the Black Gotham experience, which is right around the corner on Front Street. And we really do work as far as New Amsterdam, New York, into what is now Manhattan, or the island of Manhattan. And even here in this very building, historically, right, this is where George Washington did his inauguration. Slaves built this entire space. It was the slaves who were the cobblers. It was the slaves who were the port workers. It was the slaves who did that. It was the slaves who had to build Wall Street, which was also the slave auction block, right? So if we're talking about the ways in which Black people have contributed to America and at the same time been systemically and institutionally held down, even the founding fathers rebelled off of the very basis that the British were freeing their slaves and their colonies. The British were letting their slaves go in Jamaica and all these other places, right? And so in the 1740s, there were already rebellions that were happening because Black folks were saying, we built this, we did this, and no more, right? So the 1770-12 rebellion, the 1741 rebellion, where the most famous article, and all of these things are documented, but they're documented through law cases. They're documented because that every Black person was rounded up in 1712 and 1713 and essentially sentenced to death. And so that is the only spaces in which we see Black folks mentioned historically. And I like to talk about New York City in particular because New York City is seen as this progressive space, that it was really isolated from the making of America in this like progressive way, when actuality without New York City you wouldn't have a slave trade, right? Because New York City was your port. So if you're coming from the colonies to New York City, right, that's where you drop off your slaves, that's where you drop off everything that you got from the islands, your sugar, your tobacco, and you bring the rest back to England. And the opposite, right? So if you're coming from England to New York City, that's where I get my provision, that's where I get my food and all the things to feed my slaves on the plantations and the islands, right? So without New York City, you have no transatlantic slave trade. And so with that, the founding fathers intentionally said, we're gonna rebel because this is about slavery, about keeping our property, about reclaiming and sustaining our power dynamics, right, here in the US. And so anti-Blackness is really, I think, an intentional making by all those who have held power historically, as Brittney has said, Dr. Cooper has said, of who has that power and how they want to keep it. Has always been the ways in which this system in America that you call the Project of America has been established.
But I really want to ask the sort of second part of the question again. And I know I asked a really long question in the beginning, but the second part of the question is, how does it change our politics to understand things in the way that you all have described? Right?
How would it?
Yeah, how would it change our politics? Yeah, right. It's an aspirational thing. But at the same time, I do have to say that I think that we're at a particular moment that social scientists, like political scientists, call a critical juncture, right? So I feel like we're in a moment where people may feel, like many people may feel like, oh, I've misunderstood the way that things are. Right? I have misunderstood, right? Like I think that a lot of people are having a moment of doubt. And so I think that this is a moment that it's possible to, or it may be possible to help people understand the world in a different way.
haven't we been at this juncture, right? I mean, I imagine that this post-Reconstruction, like, phase, right? Like, so we had Reconstruction, it's like, oh,
Oh, you mean,
know.
have we been at it before?
Yeah, we've been in this cycle before, right?
We
so,
have had,
I mean, so you could say, Reconstruction period, kind of, at the time, there were some kind of more kind of black newspapers, kind of abolitionist themes kind of papers. Black people are kind of getting into kind of office, and local black communities are kind of gearing their own wealth. And then there's this massive pushback, right? And then we have this huge lynching period and Jim Crow laws, and so I feel like there was probably that moment then where people were like, you know what, slavery's not a good thing, is it?
Yeah.
Right? And then there was this moment maybe we got there close to there right now too, right? And then it was like, well, no, I don't know. I feel like we're in the same cycle.
So I think there are a couple of assumptions floating that we should make more apparent.
Yeah.
And one of those assumptions is the notion that more information, that when we know better, we do better.
Thank you.
Right? Is that true? That's the first question. Right? Can we trust that more facts, more information, we are in an information super age in many ways. We have more information at our fingertips than we've ever had before. And now people are saying they don't trust any of it, right? Now we have a crisis of expertise. We have a crisis where folks don't trust the news. Everyone feels anti-institutional. Everybody is a Wikipedia expert and a Facebook PhD and all this kind of stuff, right? And so the democratization of knowledge has also made it really hard for people to actually sort of settle in on a truth, because now you can find any narrative that supports what you want to be true. So I think we've got to first think about, Deva, whether what the real challenge is an understanding of history. And the reason that I say that is because I feel like I don't have any benevolent sort of narratives about America, but I grew up in the Deep South. I'm from a small town in northern Louisiana, so it is evangelical Republican country. And I grew up there in the 1990s. And even in the 90s, even in a conservative place like that where most folks voted Republican, I feel like my classmates would say the racism our grandparents engaged in was wrong. There wasn't, like, people said it was wrong, and that's not who we're trying to be. So when I look at their politics now and they're deeply conservative, I'm always trying to figure out how to reconcile people who had a clear sense of the wrongness of history and its tragedies, and yet they now support politicians who would reinstantiate those same systems. And so what I want to suggest is that I don't actually think this is about whether we know more or we don't, and I think that that is really hard for people who see themselves as liberal-minded folks who are reading books and who are trying to understand. I read this piece in the Post this week about new social psychological literature that says that one of the things we can see in the literature around conservative folks versus more liberal folks is that people who tend to vote for conservative positions or take conservative positions are far more fearful about drastic, terrible things happening. This research says that even the fear centers of their brains are larger, that they're born that way, right? And that the people who are less given to fear typically are more risk takers and so more invested in a liberal project. Now, let's, for the sake of argument, say that that is true, right? And that doesn't fall along racial lines. If you think about, I come out of a Black Christian tradition, and fear is used to make you follow all those rules. That's how it works, right? Bad things happen if you don't do, So what happens if we actually get away from and look, this is hard for me because I became a professor because I believe in a finely crafted argument, right? That is who I am at my core. So when I have to start thinking about people's feelings, it really irritates me. I want to say that. But I think that we are actually in a moment where we're going to have to figure out how to talk to people about the politics of fear. Because I don't actually think that this moment has anything to do with information. I think it has everything to do, if you're asking us, Deva, how does it change our politics? Well, one of the things that we're gonna have to do is sort of, one, really begin to ask people, what is it that you're afraid of, right? And why are you afraid of it? And who do you think is the enemy? And why do you think that they're the enemy? Right? And give people tools to think more critically about the things that they fear and to assess whether those fears are real and from whence they come. And if we can start to think about the emotions that people feel about this moment, maybe then we'll actually be in a better position to get people to hear us. I think that many white folks in this country, like, think that, you know, I mean, look, at home, anytime, my mama would just call me sometimes and she would say, you know, every time there's a mass shooting, all of the white people that I work with start stockpiling guns. And they start talking about how Obama is gonna take our guns, right? And so she said that, like, literally her coworkers will be going to the pawn shops and buying up all these guns, right? And so they have the opposite reaction. They don't fear the person, the shooter, they fear that their rights are going to be taken away, right? And so we've got to figure, like, look, I don't want to talk to those people who think this way, but they're some of your people, so you need to talk to them, right? About these guns and these fears. So if we're talking about what does it take to change our politics, what it takes to change our politics is to figure out the emotional and affective investments that people have in keeping the world the same or changing it, right? And so for many white folks, they want to keep the world the same because when you start talking about a world that is amenable, see, it's one thing to say, I believe in freedom and I am not a racist. It's another thing to say that you might look up one day and a black man is running the world. And so you can have a set of politics that you haven't actually emotionally resolved. Let me bring that closer. You can be a liberal white person who says, I really believe that we should have more inclusion. But how are you responding to your black boss at work? Right? Because if you, you know what I mean? Like that's actually the place that it has to happen, Deva. It isn't about information. People are it's the thing about how, like, polling data, you know, people will tell us that they're going to vote one way. It's why we didn't necessarily see the presidential outcome that we got. And then people went in the voting booth and did a different thing. So folks know what they're supposed to say, and we even know what we're supposed to think. But that doesn't mean that we've done the emotional work to actually show up to this new place that we say that we want. Right? Because it's one thing to say, if you're a white liberal person, that you think we should be inclusive. But when you assess that what that means is that white people actually have to give up some power, then are you really prepared to do that? And I would argue that to the extent that your whole sense of livelihood and stability and everything that you know is rooted in the notion that your people are on top and that you can find people who think like you, then giving that up is actually a level of emotional work that we don't have the number of therapists trained to help us do.
Well, okay, we have to move on to the next section. But at the same time, I do want to think and say that some of this transformation is not deliberate, right? Like, or is not only, I mean, it has to be deliberate, but I mean, some of it is not only about self-interest. Some of it is really about training your brain, right? So for example, this is not at the level of race, but at the level of gender and gender nonconformity. I have a total intellectual understanding of what you're supposed to do in the case, right? The mistake that I made earlier, right? I have a total understanding of what you're supposed to do in terms of paying attention to the way people gender themselves, but I still made the mistake, right? That's a personal transformation piece that people have to be aware of to work on a variety of different valences.
But
and
that's
part of
very
what
different, right? That's very different from being a white person who's been kind of trained or who's grown up believing that you are somehow, even poor Appalachian, like, you know, whites, that you are somehow superior to blacks, kind of realizing that you actually might need the same shit that some black people need. And so maybe you should vote. This is my issue with self-interest sometimes, right? Maybe you should vote in ways that fulfill your self-interest and they would cover other people that don't look like you. I don't know, I think that I don't always think people, one, I agree, I don't always think people do better when they know more know better, right? But I'm also really, and I think people are very selective about what information they take in, right? And I don't think transformation is that easy. I think people need to let go of particular things. I'm not invested in that work. I'm not invested in changing the hearts and minds of whites. That's not why I'm here.
Okay. No, but okay.
Here on Earth, not on this stage.
Right, no, I understand. But, okay. We have to go to the Q&A section, but I do want to talk about this idea of transformation because of what excites me so much about the movement for Black Lives, for example, is I think that it actually encourages transformation all the way down. Like, I think it encourages transformation from top to bottom, right? From bottom to top. Exactly. So, and all the way around, too, like in ways that we don't always, right, think about or talk
And
about.
if I could say very brief,
And this will be the last comment, and then we'll move on. I'm sorry. Where's the timekeeper? Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
if I can say very briefly, I remember after Philando Castile's shooter was exonerated, that I wrote a piece that was probably one of the most difficult pieces that I ever wrote, and it talked about the way in which Black death matters
Okay.
to this country. And the way that it matters is because either the country is going to allow Black death to continue, and that allows people, in allowing that, that means they're not going to basically challenge the powers, the policies, the people. But then in not having to challenge that, they don't have to challenge themselves.
Right.
And so it literally matters to their sense of self, to their sense of being, to the sense of who they are, to the sense of who they think their country is. Because either this country is post-racial, which is what they believe, which is what they've built their sense of self on, which they've built their sense of this nation on, or this country is deeply and fundamentally anti-Black. But in order for them to come to the realization that it is deeply anti-Black, they have to think the opposite of Black death matters, which is Black life, and they can't. And so I wrote about how, like, the notion of America being post-racial is a fundamentally American notion. So we like to think of this as a new phenomenon. But every racist idea in history has been like a post-racial idea. It's caused Americans, it's caused white people to think the problem is not the pervasiveness of racial discrimination, the problem is those Black people. Like, that's a very old idea, right? And so this even though we use the term now, post-racial, there was colorblind before that, there was states' rights before that, there were other sort of terms. And I just wanted to sort of mention that when we talk about transformation, people, like, they are so deeply tied, not only from an emotional standpoint, not only to themselves, but to their social circles and to their country. Like, when you are born and raised into believing that this is the greatest country ever, the greatest people walk this country, that you are part of this great race, that you've built your sense of self on that, you've built your sense of history, you've built your family's history on it. We've strived because we worked so hard. It's so hard to sort of disentangle yourself from all of that.
Sure.
And so really we're talking about, so I understand it's a lot, but it's necessary.
Right. Okay, so now it's time, yes, I know. It is time for the Q&A, so please, I want to get other people into this conversation and then hear again from our panel.
First and foremost, thank you guys for coming out. Dr. Kendi, you used to talk about the dichotomy of freedom and liberty. Dr. Cooper, you spoke about a Supreme Court justice. Then we talked about New York City mercantilism and how Colombia was backing slave trade, and the slave trade was happening right outside. Slaves built this building. So when we talk about all those things, the common thread that I see is capitalism and the exploitation of the masses, right? So when we talk about taking back power today and building a coalition, a multicultural coalition, how do we do that when we're built within a system aimed at exploiting people of color? Then you bring up Philando Castile, who's a Latino cop. Like, the cop who killed him was a Latino. It's like this idea of black, white, I think it's the wrong fight. And I want to hear your thoughts on how do we take back power as a collective whole while understanding American history.
I don't know who that's directed towards, but Key, do you have something to say about that?
I think, firstly, the idea that America is not black and white is an incorrect, just an assumption to make. just because before there was any invention of other races entering into the America context, right? As far as America was concerned, these were colored Negro slaves, and everybody else was good. To an extent, right? So you still had your white folks coming in who would be indentured servants, but at some level they were eventually made into higher than black, which is what was their acceptance, right? Their acceptance was to be part of that white system, that white supremacist system that would accept them in some way to be different than black. So this is back to anti-blackness. The ideal that there is this wish or want in American history for multiculturalism to be some type of satisfactory answer, in my movement is not true, right? As far as the way that in which we work, our work is to become self-determined. It's really that simple for us. It's really that simple to have some type of governance that reflects our values, our principles, values our lives, and that if that governance is not available, to then become ungovernable, to resist the status quo, to show up and say, this is not acceptable for my life or the lives that came before me. So historically speaking, if you're looking at largely, especially what, I don't know who just said it, but in terms of like, you're the greatest country. You also have to fight with the fact that you're not. You have to transform yourself into understanding that you never have been great, because at the very core of your flaw, right, the very core of your system is a huge flaw of oppression and capitalism. And this just ongoing acceptance that was stated earlier, that power belongs to those that can oppress, that power belongs to those that own property, from people to buildings to walking past Trump Hotel on the way here. I was like, this is not the business.
Right.
And so just really thinking strategically about capitalism, we have historically as black folks called for the destruction of capitalism. Historically, because it serves nobody, right? And so until there's an investment from white people, from non-black people of color to say capitalism does not serve us, in regards to the work that I do, it is not my responsibility to convince anybody else that that's the case. It is my responsibility to make sure that when we are disrupting the status quo, when we are pushing back, when we are radicalizing ways of thought and being transformative, that it's larger than a particular community, and that it's a long-term plan. It's a long-term goal, right? As Dr. Cooper just said, it's not worrying about the next mass shooter, it's what can I do to protect my own in case this happens? And that's a large community acceptance. And so part of the black liberation struggle has always been anti-capitalistic.
Can I say that every time I hear someone say, the struggle is not about race, it's always about capitalism, it annoys me to no end. Let me be really, really honest about that. Because if we destroyed capitalism tomorrow, we would still have white supremacy and patriarchy. Because anti-blackness precedes capitalism, and patriarchy precedes capitalism, right? And so it's not the wrong fight, because the thing of, it's Audre Lorde, this is not a single issue fight because we're not single issue people, right? And so what I hope that we get to is a way to be able to hold complexity and to say, like, Professor Kendi's book is really helpful in helping us to think about how anti-blackness links up with the capitalist sort of project of America, right? So that this is why black folks become the laborers that drive that capitalist project, right? But anti-black ideas precede, so even though you don't have a full system of race, you do have, anti-black ideas that float really in the very earliest sort of knowledge systems that we have. And so my question is always, Why do we have an investment in thinking that there's one overarching system and that when we destroy it, we will have destroyed everything? I don't even believe that about white supremacy, right? Because when I listen to the way that people talk about white supremacy, I'm like, patriarchy precedes that. Our hatred of women and femmes precedes our hatred of black folks and precedes any sort of capitalist system that we have. And at the same time, I think that all those systems are structured they're so intertwined that we've got to figure out how to get at all of them simultaneously. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to say that if Deva, one of the things we're supposed to do is figure out how to talk about this better, then one of the things that we must do is not say to black folk in particular, you're narrating your struggle wrong. You don't have to convince black people that capitalism is a problem. We on the bottom of a capitalist totem pole all the time. We know capitalism is a problem, right? We know the ways in which the system is driven by money. But what we are saying is that there is a way to, like, sometimes white folks are just trying to say, look, when I walked into this building today, a white man was here. He came in, and there was a way that he did an assessment of me and decided that I was nobody and then ignored me. And then the organizer of this event came over and spoke to me, and then that white man started talking to me. Because then he realized I was somebody, right? And then he ran his own assessment of me, right? Oh, where do you work? Well, which Rutgers do you work at? Because, you know, there's a narrative about, you know, which Rutgers matters, right? And so when I work at the flagship Rutgers, right, in New Brunswick. And then he literally said, oh, that's what I mean. I walk in, and I'm a panelist on this event, and I got a white man no one is coming here to listen to him, and he feels like he has the right to assess me, right? And so he did it automatically. He dismissed me, then he assessed me, right? That's the kind of stuff we're talking about, this way that microaggression and micro-engagement is not about capitalism first and foremost, right? It's about his inability to see me as somebody worthy of visibility. Now, the thing is, right, my resistance is, I don't give a fuck. I saw what he was doing, and I was like, let me leave, let me walk away, because I don't want to talk to you. But how dare you assume, but the way he walked into the room and owned it, and I was like, nobody even cares what you have to say tonight, sir. Like, that's the kind of thing that black people are trying to talk to you about, and it happens in every space that we're in. And until we can hold those things, then we can't sort of do better about these broader narratives.
Okay, I want to take another question. Yes. I want to take another question. Do we have another question here? Okay. All right.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions. We're having this discussion in a city that in 1945, 50% of the workforce in this city was in unskilled labor jobs in New York City. And when I was a young man, if somebody didn't have a college or had a high school education, they could raise their family and buy a house and live a relatively decent life. That doesn't exist anymore in New York, okay? And I would argue that in wide swaths of our population, white, disproportionately affecting people of color, Hispanics, blacks, etc., that economic ability of mobility, albeit as limited as it was, is no longer the case. So those kind of issues affect all of us in different ways. So the question I have is, what do you see when we have a person in the White House who weaponizes daily these differences, uses this tactically, yesterday with the Pocahontas comment, all the time he's doing this. And part of what I see in this discussion is what happened 50 to 60 years ago. The idea of progress, the consensus form of how people viewed America in a fantasy way, that broke down in the 60s and has never, ever recovered. And what I see is we're still fighting over how do we resynthesize this in a way that incorporates everybody. So I'm wondering what thoughts you have about these kind of questions. The economic, I don't agree with that. I do think issues of, I don't think any of us disagree with that. The question of socioeconomic progress, how that impacts that, because we don't have that right now in our society.
So I'm sorry. So what's your question?
Well, more or less, you know, the question of the issue of the basic breakdown of socioeconomic power for most Americans, and how you see that impacting on the particular issues that you're discussing today, which disproportionately affects African Americans.
Well, I think if I can say briefly, I think the fundamental question for those generations of people, even for people today, is the question of why. So why is it that I do not have that ability, you know, my family, myself as a worker, to, quote, progress? And the way that that why has been answered is immigrants, is black people, is women, is gays and lesbians and trans. I mean, basically is all of these people have been described as the reason why. And that has then led to a politics that has been focused on incarcerating, banning those groups of people. And then simultaneously, those very people who were incarcerating or banning or oppressing or killing those people were cutting taxes, were actually the very reason why that was happening. And so, you know, we've been talking a lot, you know, about like, how do you reach these people, right? Reach these people who literally believe that the reason why they're struggling or the reason why they haven't got a promotion is because of somebody who's not even there. You know, somebody who can't even get into that position. You know, how do you reach that person? How do you get that person to see that? And I think that's the very question, and that's the way racialized violence and even racist ideas play out constantly. And that's how they're able to manipulate people into thinking that a billionaire is actually their friend. That Trump's best group were white people making between the income of 50 and 100,000. That segment is the segment that was key in his victory. How is it that that segment of people who are going to be murdered by this tax cut, how is it that they can imagine that this person is actually their beneficiary? And you know, the only way that they can do that is because of their consumption, their mass consumption of bigotry, their mass consumption that I am struggling because of them. And I think that's what we have to sort of come to grips with. But that wasn't just in 1940. That wasn't just the last 70 years. That was even before that, right? That was during the Great Depression and even before that. You know, people were fed the same ideas. People were fed the idea that, you know what, I as a poor enslaved white person living in, a poor white person in South Carolina in 1850, that I'm not going to ally with enslaved black people. I'm going to strive to be a slave owner. You know, I'm going to be a planter.
I'm just going to jump. I'm just going to take that leap.
Yeah, I mean, like, and I believe it's true because it's the American dream.
It totally is the American dream.
Right? And if I'm being denied the American dream, it certainly isn't because of that planter. It must be because of those people of color.
Yeah. Can I jump on that with one example? I think welfare is probably a good example, right? I like to kind of think, and some of this you can totally kind of blame maybe media, right? If you think about welfare queen, right, the kind of emergence of this term in the 70s was Reagan, right? Reagan, I think it was based on Linda Taylor, Chicago woman who was like damn good at scamming, man. I think she had like 80 names or like 80 addresses, like 50 names. She had $150,000 a year, like untaxed. Like she was racking up. She's like an exception, right, to welfare. But before this happened, I mean, during the 60s, kind of coinciding with the civil rights movement, right? The language in kind of news media starts to shift around kind of welfare, and the imagery around who's a recipient of kind of government funding and welfare starts to shift, right? So I think this is a recently there's I want to say 2016 article. One of the author's last name is Black and Sprague, two writers, and it's about welfare reform and kind of how news media in the 60s kind of created the visual of the welfare recipient as a black person, right? And so we moved from black woman, definitely. So we moved from like, I'd say early 60s, welfare, about 27% of images in news media are black, right? And then we go one more year, and we're at 47% of the images associated with welfare are Black. And then we get to 2 years out, and we're at like 80% of the images feature Black people, right? That's where, so then the policy follows, right? By the time we get to Clinton, we're like, fuck this welfare shit. Like, these Black people are like running out of here. They're like flying over. I think it was it Gingrich who was like, this woman has gone to Hawaii, and she like, and I was like, really? How are these people using these EBT cards to buy plane tickets? I can't even buy a plane ticket with my regular credit card. But I think that's by and large a big part of kind of how some of this messaging kind of can impact policy and the things that we vote for, even though Black people aren't the most people on, Black women aren't the most people on welfare, right? One would take that away from reading something that these are the people who are siphoning funds, right? And so there's this really interesting moment in the article where they talk about how because we have now believe that welfare recipients are Black and undeserving, and this is kind of coinciding with kind of the 90s, we also believe that they're drug addicts, right? And so people who are taking welfare from us are also using welfare to buy drugs, and so now we need to implement policies to make sure people who are getting welfare are tested for drugs, right? And so there's a really interesting stat that Missouri has spent like $300 and something thousand testing like thousands of people for drug use, and they find like 48 people. Like, you've spent $500,000 to find 48 positives of hundreds of thousands of people. Like, it's kind of ridiculous, but that emerges from the fact that we believe this narrative that the person who is taking from us, right, who is taking our tax money, is some Black woman who's lying about, you know, her children, who's having extra babies so she can kind of take home $200 extra a month. Like, that's partly what I'm thinking about.
So we have to, and I'll come right back to you, but we have to end this segment. But I want to follow up in sort of our next meeting, the question and answer. So we're going to focus on the panel again for a few minutes and then get back to the question and answer. But I do want to follow up and draw out this issue that Brittney introduced as the politics of fear, right? And that, Alex, you have been elaborating, you know, in a different way. And I want to think about more specifically about the movement itself, and an interesting and frightening thing that just happened a couple of months ago when the Department of Justice designated, kind of out of the blue, that there was a new domestic terrorist threat in the United States, right? There was a new domestic terrorist threat in the United States. That domestic terrorist threat was not lone white men who have been convicted of domestic violence who then go on to murder lots of people. No. Instead, that new domestic terrorist threat was something called Black identity extremists, right? So I want to talk to the panel about how this kind of follows on from the conversation that we have been having, and what it means. What it means in the sort of context of the conversations we've been having, but also concretely what it means and has meant for activism as well.
So when that report came out, it was not surprising to a lot of us who have been doing movement work when the FBI shows up at my grandmother's house 4 hours away and asks, do you know that your granddaughter is in Los Angeles, California, sleeping on the ground right now for an Occupy? Or, you know, when they show up in other spaces that you occupy, when you already know that you have an FBI file on you. We all have done this work. Everybody in my chapter has done this work, and we all have files. The American government is never interested in necessarily what you are doing, but who you are. And we see this, especially the most probably iconic for me to think of is Fred Hampton, right? Don't let there be another Black Messiah. He is dangerous because he can be a Black Messiah, because when he speaks, people listen, because he is able to empower and unite the masses to really see the way that oppression affects everybody in this country. Historically, when Black folks uprise, there is this automatic paranoia because there is the ongoing criminalization of Black bodies. So not just organizers, not just activists that are very visible, not the Opal Tometi's of the world, but more so that everyday Black America is under surveillance. Going back to welfare, going back to folks who have to live in low impoverished communities, if you live in a New York City project, you are under constant surveillance, meaning the NYPD does not need a warrant to open your door because you are in a public government building. meaning that if someone in your family jumps their turnstile, your family in public housing can be given permanent exclusion, which means that for jumping the turnstile for $2.75, your family can permanently be excluded from accessing public housing. Right, to the fact that there are floodlights that beam inside of project windows every single night from 10 p.m. to 6:30 in the morning. To that, I live directly across the street from what was media news of a Lower East Side white man had Confederate flags in his window, and that became a hyper thing, and white allies contacted me and said, we want to come down there, we want to do a light brigade sign that says Black Lives Matter right across the street from him, and we want to leave it there. And I said, well, what are your unintentional impacts? Once you come down and place that sign there, you go back to Brooklyn that you've now gentrified, and you go back to Harlem that you've now gentrified in our communities, right? What happens to the black and brown people who live there every single day, that the police occupy their neighborhoods every single day? That just invites more surveillance, more violence, more occupation of the spaces that black and brown people live in. So until there's this acceptance, not realization, because we know, but until there's overall acceptance and a movement towards really not surveilling people of color, which comes from the global aspect of the US when there's an NYPD headquarters in Israel, right? The NYPD trains Israeli soldiers, and they share information in order to learn how to occupy black and brown neighborhoods. So it's not surprising that there's a COINTEL 2.0, as we call it, because it's constantly been happening, right? From the plantation of having an overseer, of not being able to leave the plantation until you have papers, and even those papers not being good enough to keep you free and safe. So there has constantly been a surveillance and a physical oppression of black bodies that hasn't shifted, even in the digital age. It hasn't shifted. We have to take digital security, trainings, and we have to, everything's on Signal, and what do we actually know is encrypted and not, right? And so there's all these extra precautions and prevention measures that we have to take for what reason other than being black and disrupting the status quo and acting and asking and demanding for better quality of life of very, very, very basic needs, which go back to this like whole criminalization of black people, of the other, of the one that's taking away, who are the most impacted, the most oppressed, when you have black trans women who will never, whose life expectancy is 35 years, when you have black trans women whose salaries are $10,000 a year, when you have black trans women who 1 in 2 at some point will be imprisoned. All of these things are the criminalization of black bodies to say you don't belong here, and if you do belong here, here are the rules you have to play by, and anytime you try to disrupt those rules or disrupt the norm, then you have no power, you are powerless.
Or educate the public, right? So it's part of the clapback is about Black Lives Matter making education, like information more widespread, right, about oppression, right? So if you look, I mean, I always situate stuff in terms of media. So if you, let's maybe think about COINTEL, what we know is maybe 1.0, right? So if you think about, the Black Panther Party, or even just kind of the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? And so this is kind of the heyday for like black publications, right? We have Jet Magazine, Nation of Islam has their own paper, Muhammad Speaks, which is like one of the more widely read papers at the time, which I might add, the first version of that paper, I think it was called Some of This Earth to Call My Own or Else, which I actually like that title better. And then we have kind of the Panther paper, which when it first came out in the late 60s, I think was just a 4-page newspaper, and by the time we get deeper into the publication, which has all kind of information about programs, about kind of social justice information, about where people in the black community can kind of access food.
The
now
very basic creation of welfare programming.
Absolutely. One of the more widely circulated black papers, the most actually in the United States, at 300,000 a week. So now we have COINTELPRO, right? And so, if we kind of fast forward now, and so most of those papers, in part maybe because of, you know, when we think about Jet and Ebony and Black Enterprise, many of these papers kind of emerged in part because mainstream media in the 40s was still very racist, right? You know, you have, I think at the time, the New Orleans Times-Picayune had, many of these Southern papers had policies against even featuring Black people, right? They had people on staff whose jobs were to go and like search for Black images and actually take them out, right? And so a lot of these papers emerged as a result of ways to inform people. You know, you had mainstream papers at the time that being delivered to Black communities, the truck would actually stop and then remove the financial sections, right? So these papers emerged as a need to kind of inform these communities. And so what you find is when you find a movement that's figured out a way to communicate to people and get information and access to services, that there is this kind of clapback that happens. And so I would say that this Black identity extremist, right, which is like a heck of an SEO term, because if you even get to Black identity, you're fucked, right? You don't even need to put extremists in, you're already flagged. What you'll find now is that many of these papers that dissolved in the 60s, right, which were ways for kind of Black people to kind of share information and just kind of more just equitable and even like reportage, they collapsed. They didn't have funding, they didn't have, you know, they couldn't keep up kind of advertising, kind of print costs, and so now we're online, right? We have Black Voices and The Root and all of these other places where Black folks are saying, wait a minute, I read that article and here's my rebuttal, right? There's information exchange, and now what's on the table? Net neutrality. So what I see is kind of this back and forth. I'm not at all surprised that emerged, right? You would imagine that would be something that might pop up when Barack was here, but I think when you look at the people who are emerging to kind of step forward in this Trump age, it's like, shit, these Black folks might actually survive this man. Like, let's figure out. Because that term was released and made public like a week before Charlottesville, a rally that we all knew was coming, right? Like, the timing is kind of impeccable. So, I don't know. I'm not shocked by that. I think that is kind of part of the history and lineage of how the FBI has worked, and I think you can look back just as recent as the Black Panther movement and see kind of the same things at play.
I just want to jump in and say the latter part of that identification, which was left out of what you coined, was Black identity extremists, and then it goes on to explain that we might rise up and clap back, right? We might rise up and intentionally and predetermined to start killing police officers in retaliation for the numerous amounts of deaths that have been, you know, acquitted and just completely dismissed on various levels. So the very last part of that is not just that you're a Black identity extremist, but by being labeled as so is a response to the Black rage that is happening right now that says, what is the book? We Will Shoot Back. You know, and so all of these questions around, like, when exactly are Black folks going to be able to arm themselves again, which concealed weapons was a response from the Black Panther Party, all the laws coming out saying that you can't carry and open carry, all the response to the Black Panthers being walking around in rifles and protecting their own families and doing their own circles of cop watch, right? So I just wanted to add that the last part of that is extremely important to say that it's together, it's partnered together, that not only are you excited and joyful and proud to be Black again, but that you are understanding and realizing what the system is doing to you, is committing genocide through the hands of state-sanctioned violence on many levels, which we understand when we think about imprisonment, we think about lack of basic resources, we think about the fact that Flint still doesn't have clean water, we think of the reaction to Puerto Rico, right? So we think of all these different things, and what they say is, you might just get mad enough to start killing off some people. Now we need to identify you because you're a danger.
Can I say one thing? Sorry.
Well, let's let Brittney have her say, and then we'll come back.
So what I want to say about this, a couple things. One is, around this time last year, people started sending me emails saying, oh, you've been put on a right-wing professor watch list. And so there are these well-funded, small, right-wing organizations that target college professors, those of us who teach in ethnic studies, those of us who teach in Black studies, and anyone who does anything about Palestine, right? And they put us on watch list. They send in the case of my colleagues, they often will plant students who secretly record lectures and report back. And this is a well-funded sort of thing that is happening. In my case, it has led to significant death threats, harassment of my colleagues, being profiled on Fox News, which becomes a rallying cry for people to then really sort of deeply harass you, calls for my firing from my job. Before I had tenure, I got tenure anyway, which is a win, right? And, but also even doing more insidious things like passing my address around online and saying, oh, she's from here, go, what do we know about her? So when we talk about the politics or surveillance, before this FBI watch list category that they've created, right-wing groups were already setting up the grammar to do it again in this moment by saying we're going to surveil you. And that links back up to the politics of fear, because what they want us to do is be afraid and then be silent, right? And so it's about sort of learning what the psychology of that is. And look, this shit is scary, but white supremacy has never not been scary, so we just have to teach anyway. We just have to do it anyway. But the other thing I want to say too, Key, is so I agree with you that there's this fear that black people will rise up, but I actually think, given the speed with which they have manufactured this category, and we haven't seen the sort of, we haven't even had the major sort of moments of the, BLM carrying guns and patrolling the police. It's not even the iconography of black power, right? They're creating a category because Sessions is using the grammar of Nixon and then of Reagan in one key way, which is that when our government wants to start a war on black people, they literally start a war. They create an enemy. They manufacture an enemy. They say that it's a threat. They use discourses to whip up their base, and then they create the justification to be able to get these sort of policies passed to use these resources. So they're literally naming something that doesn't exist, because all they're really saying, it's not black identity extremists. They think that blackness and anyone who appreciates their blackness is an extremist. They think that if you don't hate being black, and if you're not Ben Carson, and if you're not a black Republican who gets on television and disavows everything related to blackness, that you are they think Barack Obama is a black identity extremist. Real talk. Real talk. These people, based upon their formulation, because the thing is, from 2009 until 2016, white people experienced Barack Obama as a kind of extremism of American racial politics that I don't think psychically most white folks know what to do with. And so look, I'm not trying to do pop psychology. I am saying that psychic whiteness is a real problem, and one of the ways it shows up is that it projects itself and gaslights us. So it says you're being an extremist in the moment where we have Charlottesville. You're being an extremist in the moment where we have white supremacist ideology coming from the highest levels of government. You're being an extremist when we appoint an attorney general that Coretta Scott King herself said was terrible, that Reagan wouldn't appoint because he was too racist, right? And so you literally have an inversion principle happening in terms of how this moment is being narrated. I think that is the thing that is really scary. And Deva, it reminds me of the thing you asked us at the beginning. How do we get people to change this? One of the reasons that I went for the emotional piece is not because I don't think better information will help us, but it's because we keep on people are so deeply invested in an inverted narrative. That how do you, and they distrust those of us who say you actually have shit turned upside down, and that's why you don't see clearly. So how do you reestablish the authority? Because here's what it would require to actually get out of this moment. We would have to have white people in this country to believe what black people say is true about the country. You would have to believe the narrative. You would have to believe that America is so deeply invested in racism. You would have to believe that black people are credible arbiters of facts, right? You would have to believe that. And instead, what these folks are doing is sort of reframing the narrative so that we're the ones who sound crazy. We're the ones who sound like we don't have a grasp on the facts. We're the ones who sound like we're narrating history deliberately so that America looks bad, right? And so those become the challenges. And I think what is most scary, and this is the work we have to do, and this is why we have to be in the battleground of language. When like I've said for a long time, when we declared war on drugs, that is language that begets violence, right? When we say black identity extremists, what they're doing is putting us on notice that they plan to kill a new generation of black activists. Let us be really clear about what they are saying, because we can look at the trajectory of what has happened. They are saying, we see you as a threat to the American project. And here is the other thing. If you want to know what is factually true, then if black identity extremists is what they see as a threat, then what is to the American project? Then that tells you something about what the American project is. That means the American project is a white supremacist project, because anybody who likes being black is literally anathema to that project and must be exterminated, right? And look, I know that this language is it feels bombastic. But what I want to say is that we have to match, this is the last thing I think is important to say. You cannot expect black people to engage in civil discourse when you have governmental actors casting us as extremists. There is no civil, reasonable discourse that is going to undo that. It's the same thing that happens after 9/11 when we cast everyone else as a terrorist. That language it does so much work that I can't match that rhetoric with anything other than calling out the extremism of what it is. And that is the thing that I want to say. Because sometimes in these discourses, we're like, well, why are y'all so angry? Why can't you be more reasonable? Why can't a reasoned argument work? Because you've already said that we're enemies of the state, right? And at the point that you're an enemy of the state, that literally means somebody has a target on your back, they're training a gun on you, and so we're acting like a reasonable engagement will work. But to echo Ibram, right? He reminded us that Philando Castile offered a reasonable explanation to the officer and still ended up dead. That is the moment that we're in. And so one of the things that I really actually do want white people to help me to understand is, what are the terms of discourse that work to compel white people to think about black people differently? We actually have to put white people on the spot and ask you guys, right? Because it's your folks who we're trying to convince. And that's the thing that's terrible. We're all convinced. Right?
Not all of us, right?
Right, we're convinced. But it's white people who struggle with this, and we don't know what the terms of discourse are. If you're reasonable, you still get killed. If you're unreasonable, you get killed. Literally, we jumped the shark. We're in a place where there's no thing we can point to that says that. So what then do we do? Right? That is what Jeff Sessions marshals when he uses the language of extremism. He's doing this thing, to put my scholar hat on, where he's saying they're so exceptionally violent and a threat that anything goes for them. We want you to write us a blank check to do anything we can to them. That is what he is saying. He is saying we want to cast black people as being in a state of exception. We see them as a threat to the state. So if we have to go in their houses in the middle of the night and exterminate them, if we have to surveil their families, if we have to lock them up and give them no rights, we want to be able to do that. And the way that you do it is you first get white people to believe that the problem is so extreme that this must happen. And if you think that it can't happen in this generation, just think about what we did after 9/11. This is what we do to our Arab American brothers and sisters and siblings already. So we already have the script again to be able to do it to black people in this moment.
Okay. Ibram, I know you've been trying to get in. I don't know if you've given up.
I think we can go to it next.
Okay. So I have, there are a lot of questions that I'm not getting to ask, but I have this, I want to follow up on this question of narrative, because part of what I think that we're doing here is trying to think about and follow up on this question of what terms of discourse are we supposed to be using, right? Because I think between knowledge and facts and psychology is narrative, right? And there is some evidence that people are open to new kinds of narrative, right? So this is just, from the viewpoint of public opinion polling, right, from the viewpoint of political behavior, there is some evidence that people, black people, white people, non-black people of color of all kinds are interested in finding a new way to understand the world, right? Because we are in a moment where people feel that perhaps they have misunderstood the world. But as Ibram told us, that movement's not only in one direction, right? Meaning that it's not a narrative of progress from the left. It's not just about like, oh, what can radicals tell us about this moment? It's also a moment where you have an opening for white supremacy and white supremacists. The recent New York Times article, right, that got all of the blowback about the kind and gentle, the sort of Mr. Friendly Nazi, right, is another way in which this movement can happen. So, yeah, I don't know. So that's a kind of inarticulate question. But I want us to really kind of engage in thinking about, I don't know, how to break new ground, how to break the cycle that we've been in since before the founding of the nation, right? Since Reconstruction, since the Great Depression, since, like, how do we make headwinds, or is it possible to make headwinds in terms of understanding the reality that we live in a different way, so that the other can't be made into a monster, right, to which you can do anything?
Well, I think we first and foremost have to recognize that we are in a struggle over narrative and over language, and over terms and concepts. And I think that I wanted, in the book I just wrote, I wanted to think clearly about maybe different concepts. So, going back to those white people who have been led to believe that the problem is not Republican politicians who are steering money from public education to the military. The problem is women who are having more children because they want to have more welfare. And that's why the state has less money for them. And so that, I wanted to sort of describe the creators of that idea as distinct from the consumers of that idea. So in other words, like I talked about the producers of these ideas, of this language, of this narrative, producers of racist ideas, and the consumers of racist ideas. So we can first and foremost distinguish and try to understand that in many ways, many people are consuming ideas. And so then the question becomes, why are these people producing these ideas for the mass consumption of Americans? What is the purpose? And then we begin to see that these people are actually producing these ideas to substantiate and justify and rationalize discriminatory policies, and that benefit who? Them. And so, they're producing ideas to mass manipulate people into believing that, no, those policies aren't the problem, those people are the problem. And so then they won't resist those policies. Instead, they'll spend their time resisting and challenging those people. And so when we sort of think through that, then we can see the ways in which, people have been manipulated. That doesn't mean you're not racist is all. That doesn't mean you haven't consumed racist ideas your whole life, but it also allows you to see how other people were producing ideas that you consumed, that you then believed, that you then acted upon, and they may not have even believed those ideas themselves. Yeah. So I mentioned the example of the woman on welfare. There was a report, I think in mid-1980s, written by a Reagan aide. And he said in this report, and I'm paraphrasing him, that we don't have any evidence that substantiates that these women are having more babies in order to get more welfare, but we know it's true. So they were acting as if this was actually statistically true. They were creating these narratives because it benefited people to drive against welfare so they can then take that money and continue to cut taxes. for their benefactors, right? And so I'm just sort of talking about, I think we have to have a more sophisticated sort of analysis of language and narrative making, and who's making these narratives, who's making these terms. And this is, I think, what Brittney was talking about. Like, there's a project that is already underway, that people are thinking past this term, right? And so just like Reagan was thinking past the term of the war on drugs, anyway, so I think everybody sort of understands the point. And so I think one of the things that I am trying to sort of show in my work is that racist policies are actually preceding racist ideas. And that all these forms of self-interest are actually leading to racist policies. In other words, you have really self-interest, economic, political, cultural self-interest that are driving the creation of racist policies. In other words, I am supporting slaveholding because it makes me money. And then these people who are benefiting from these policies are creating and mass producing racist ideas that allow them to continue those policies, particularly when we resist them. Why are you resisting these policies? You should be resisting those black people. There's not a war on cops. There's not a war on black lives. There's a war on cops. There's not a war, slave owners are not, barbaric. They're not brutalizing these black people. These slave rebels, when they resist, they're the brutal. I mean, these are the sort of ways in which people have produced these ideas to defend themselves. And then people consume them, and then they became ignorant and hateful and fearful. Right, and then it sort of continues, this sort of cycle. And I think, one of the things that I'm also asking about even Trump is, I know we love, and even Trump officials, whenever they say something like, General Robert E. Lee was a good man, or that if only we could have compromised, we would have stopped the Civil War, or Pocahontas, or other types of things, we assume that these people are just ignorant. We just assume, and then we go on this sort of ignorant attack that, Trump is ignorant, his officials are ignorant, and that is why they're rewriting history. That is why they're saying these ignorant things. Well, could it be that they have a particular reason why they're rewriting the Civil War? Could it be that they have a particular narrative that they want to present, and they're very familiar that that narrative is factually incorrect, but they know the way in which that narrative is going to manipulate people? And so then if we come back and just think that they're ignorant, we're not even looking past that ignorance to see what is the political or economic or even cultural or power or white supremacist project behind these terms, behind this writing. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to think very deeply about what is actually happening right now.
I agree. So my work is very much about trying to teach people how to see differently, right? How to kind of shift a gaze. I think the New York Times article about the white supremacists who grocery shops, according to the photo.
Likes Adventure Time.
So as part of my work, I have a series called Counter Narratives, and what I do is I kind of find New York Times articles, the paper that I read, and I find usually some kind of journalistic flaw, and I take advantage of that to kind of redo the article in a different way to point to those flaws, right? And so one of the first ones is I kind of reimagined the Michael Brown article. And so 2 days ago, I did a kind of overnight residency at ACE, and I read the Sunday Times. And in that Times, in the A1 section, which is kind of the more important first part of the paper, there is this kind of nationalist next door, the white nationalist next door, that's what they should have titled it, article that has actually no meat to it. Even, it's journalistically kind of just airy. But what I noticed is that after we talk about this guy who has all of these kind of racist ideas, who can't pin them to anything in particular, on the right-hand side, there's the neediest cases. The New York Times does this little neediest cases where they run a profile. It's a black gay man who's homeless, who's on welfare, and I'm like, really? So juxtaposed to this guy who's saying they're taking our money and they need a lot, you run a neediest case of kind of the more marginal person right next to it. Also in the paper, on the front page, the bottom half, the lower fold of the paper, there's an article about kind of a suburb of Georgia of Atlanta, where immigration officers, ICE, is kind of sitting outside of this kind of predominantly Hispanic area and targeting people. And they're going there to kind of supposedly kind of, get criminals. People have done things, right? You hear, oh, this one guy, he's a rapist and he's been in jail, and members of the community are so afraid to leave that they're skipping work. Because one of the ways that they're being caught is they're being pulled over for failure to signal. It's like we're familiar with this, right? Failure to signal, failure to carry a driver's license, which I don't know how you perceive when somebody's driving, but okay. And so that's one of the articles. And so you hear all these kind of, things about members of this community and why they're being targeted. And then 2 pages later, there's this article, this really quirky article by the New York Times of white people who are upset and they're sleeping in Walmart parking lots. A place to go for silence and serenity is in there. And I'm really curious about the tendency to kind of create these dichotomies, right? Why? So a lot of my work is about how can you get people when they're looking at the paper to look collectively at the composition of these stories and try to figure out how, when you see these things, what you take away from them. And if you can train yourself to kind of ask particular questions, to kind of resegment, what would they do for how you approach a lot of these things that are kind of being just kind of thrown at us in places that we would normally trust information, right? Why would the Times construct the paper this way? Why this article? Because in the article, actually in the print version, so I'm more interested in print media than I am in online media, because I think these hierarchies are visible, right? You can, some articles get color paper, photos, some don't, right? And so I kind of work through that, and I think the key part of what we need to do is to figure out how to get people to see differently. And I'll use one more example from the national section, and I will say that I think the editors of this section aren't white. So there's a kind of other danger, right, that we have here about this, if it's diverse enough, and if I get a brown person to write it, right, the guy who wrote the No Angel article is black. The editor, I think, of this section that ran this kind of quirky, he's a kind of cute, hateful man, like article. He's not white. That same section had also run 2 pieces about the Bundy brothers, right? So the Bundy brothers were these kind of occupiers of Oregon, and the same time that the pipeline protests were happening. And the Bundy brothers articles in the front part of the national section is in color, and I think the title was a quote from one of the guys, which was like, we meant no evil, right? So they quoted them, so from jump, they've already kind of jumped out in their own defense. And in the back side of that, there's an article about the pipeline protests in black and white, and the title reads, Indian pipeline protests make for fearful and frustrated whites. And so I'm really curious about that segment, and how can you teach people when they read to look for that, to look for those things that seep in that aren't even actually about the internal reportage of the article, but there's this kind of framework and the structure that's been tacked on at the end. So you can actually get people who look like me to deliver this information, right? And so I think that's if you want to talk about kind of liberation as we move forward, I think one of the things that's really central to that is kind of train the eye and the brain in a particular way to kind of be able to detect those kind of things.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, yes, it's time to end the segment. I do, as I say, I do want to just really put 2 fingers on that point, though, because that's one of the things that moves me so much about your work, is that it's really difficult to teach people to perceive things structurally. Right? So perceive not only sort of what is said, but also how it's said and the framework in which it's said. And I think that you're absolutely onto something in terms of like showing things, right? Showing it visually instead of sort of giving a lecture about it, right? Because when you kind of put up the New York Times and show, but this is actually how it's presented, right? Like these are actually the ways that we are interpreting the world, right? What's wrong with that? I think that's so evocative. So now it's time for questions again. Absolutely. So we have a question here. Maybe? Where are the microphones? Oh, okay, we got it.
Thanks so much. How do you think that the idea of, well, the narrative of respectability politics informs how we color race, specifically Blackness?
I wrote a book about this. You can read it. Look, yeah, I think that the thing that I want to say about respectability politics, two things. First, respectability politics is the belief that if black people dress properly, are articulate, get educated, never screw up, and are always respectful, that we can overcome any of the exigencies of racism. That ideology emerges at the end of Reconstruction because the government has actually abandoned black people, because black people are actually dealing with extreme repression. So I want to say that so sometimes when we're like, I hate respectability politics, right? We're not always thinking about the conditions that gave rise to it, and the way that if the government was like on your side and helping, and then all of a sudden it just abandons you to a bunch of angry white people, what are you going to do? What strategy is available to you? So I want to hold that intention. I think the challenge of respectability politics is when it moves from being a strategy to navigate extreme conditions and becomes an ideology and a way that we begin to explain black people's social condition. So now, rather than saying, we gotta pull up our pants and be articulate because these white people might kill us, instead we say, black people aren't winning because they won't pull up their pants and speak like they have some sense, right? So now it's not white supremacy that's the problem, it is unruly black people who won't conform to social dictates that are the problem. I think that we have a really severe strain of this in black communities, even among black folks who have a critique of systems. And I think that again, when I try to think about what is the emotional investment, I think that one of the things that we're trying to figure out here is one of the reasons that black people invest deeply in respectability politics is because it's the one thing you can control. Well, you can't control what everybody else is going to do to you, but you can try to make sure your kid looks like they belong to somebody and, you know, have all the sort of tools that they need. And so what we have to always be doing is reminding folks that that's never the battle. That black people can be, if every black person becomes well-behaved tomorrow, white people will figure out, or white supremacy, let me say white supremacy, right? White supremacy and the way it works as an ideology would then begin to criminalize being well-behaved. Like, that is the way that it works. And so we have to always sort of be pointing to the structure as the problem and never to black bodies, never to black people, never to black folks' actions as the problem. And when I'm in black communities and trying to think through this with people, they're like, so are you saying that like we never have to take responsibility? And what I always want to say back to black people is, you know, the issue is never that black people don't take responsibility. We take responsibility for so much. We blame ourselves for everything. We blame other black people when they don't get it right. We carry around collective shame when other black people screw up. We always want to make sure the serial killer is never black, right? Is the mass shooter black? Oh God, we don't want to, right? I mean, because we have a collective sense of responsibility for our people in a sense that how other black people move affects us. So we have to, it does affect us, right? But we have to have a different critical perspective about how it affects us, right? And so we always have to be turning the lens back to white people rather than us. But it's a challenge, but I want us to be more humane in the way we think about the challenges. And I also want us to stop, look, the last thing I want to say as someone who, you know, dips in and out of movement work as time permits in some ways, is I also want us to stop in movement space and yelling at each other about respectability politics when folks are really just saying, like, treat me with a little bit of respect. We can be respectful of each other, and that doesn't have to be about being requiring respectability of each other. Those are different words and they mean different things, right? And so sometimes when you say to people, like, be strategic or be, you know, or maybe you don't want to step exactly that way, folks are like, there you go with your elitist respectability. It's like, nah, it's just that, like, look, I'm gonna go in my classes and do apparent black identity extremism with the students, but when I go to the faculty meeting, I'm not gonna cuss out my dean, right? Because we can hold both things at the same time.
Okay, so we're actually, right, we're actually at time. And so in order to, I know, we have Said a lot, right? But this is such a dense conversation. But what I want to do is I do want to give each of the panelists a chance to talk about futurity and futures, and then we'll open it up one last time for questions, and that's how we'll finish it out. And so one of the sort of movement narratives or slogans that I think is really sort of moving is I am fighting for Black futures, right? Or what makes me hopeful, in some of my interviews people have said, like, what makes me hopeful is this idea of futurity, right? That things can be different than they are now. So what do you think about this idea of futurity, right? Outside of the progress narrative that we sort of started out with, right? Like, so this notion of futurity that I think is in the movement for Black lives is not the same as the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. It's a different vision. But what does it consist in your view?
I think for me, very briefly, I think it first and foremost consists in what I think is that an activist fundamentally has to believe change is possible, right? If you're literally a change agent, that what you're doing, what you're striving for is to bring about structural change that are gonna make the lives of a particular group of people better, you have to believe that's possible. You're willing to give your life, your struggle, your time, your blood to that. You have to believe it's possible. And so in a time in which there are people who deny its possibility, you have activists who are stating that first and foremost, before we can even step out, we have to believe it's possible. I think that's a radical, revolutionary idea that I think is very difficult for some people to reach. And I agree, that's to me one of the beauties of Black Lives Matter and many of the activists, that they fundamentally believe, despite their awareness of how pervasive racism is and has long been, they simultaneously have a greater awareness of how bad things are, and they have the capacity to imagine a different type of world, a different type of space for Black people in particular to be operating in. To me, that's a very bold and revolutionary idea, and I completely agree that philosophically as an activist, you have to believe change is possible.
Really briefly, I think what I believe about the Black future is simply that I believe that Black people have a future, and I believe it's one of our own making. And I believe that because we are a future that our ancestors did not dream was possible. And so the fact that we have been able to manifest all that we are in this moment says that, again, those that we are building for can do the same. And so it would be a disrespect to that promise that we are living out to not believe it for a new generation of folks. And so on really tough days, I just remember, you know, our movement cries, right? We gonna be all right. That's a prophetic cry. That's we're gonna cast into the future the thing that we want, and also I believe that we will win. In the end, faith is the difference between what we believe and what we can prove, right? And so if you have to ask me, my faith is always in Black people.
I'm gonna struggle. I struggle with this one. But I mean, I'm gonna keep it brief as well because I do struggle with it. I think the work that I do is rooted in the belief that we can change. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say I don't know if it's possible, but that's kind of what I work towards, right? And I mean, that's why get up if you're not gonna work towards that. I know one of the things that you had kind of posed when we kind of briefly talked about is there a destination, right? Is there a place that we can go? That I don't believe in, right? I actually think this is going to be a consistent struggle. It may change the way we approach it, the obstacles that we face. And so any of the work that I do or that I support is really about kind of filling the toolbox with kind of different things to to be able to pull up when the next struggle occurs. That's kind of how I see it, right? It's trying to figure out, kind of broaden our approach to these systems, because I think they're going to stay in place and they'll keep kind of rearing their head, and it's just kind of how you get back up to challenge it, really.
The bad part about going last is like everybody already said all the things I was gonna touch on. I was like, boom. Now then Brittney was like ancestry. I was like, boom. And then I was like, damn. I think what's beautiful about this movement and what's beautiful about this current moment is the unapologetic Blackness, the unapologetic love for Black people. And I look at the global awareness of Blackness, right? That we're moving beyond American Blackness and what that means, and looking at the diaspora in a whole as to how does every Black person experience oppression and imperialism and colonization in the world. And so I think particularly the movement for Black lives has been so instrumental. And when we travel to different countries, Brazil, Colombia, South Africa, they know the names of Meg Brown. They know Sandra Bland. They know the Trayvon Martin. So they're able to identify and say, this is happening here too, under rule of people who look just like us, right? And so how long has this oppression been ingrained into our communities globally and other spaces that shows up in such a large way? And without community, without the notion that joy can exist, without the notion that, waking up itself in the morning and going out into the world is an act of resistance, that just my very being of being a Black, queer, transgender person is an act of resistance. Every breath that I take is an act of resistance against a system that does not want me to breathe, right? That does not want me to exist. Just the notion that, like, it's not just me. America has a real problem with individualism, as a problem of being the extraordinary Black, the extraordinary white person, the billionaire who got it right, all these different things in which we do that we sanctify as being exceptional. And as part of community, and when we say Black Lives Matter, and having the blessings of elders from the Black Panther Party and having the blessings of other elders from other movements say, I think y'all are gonna get it right, and if not, this is a very damn good try, because you guys include the lives of every Black person. It's not just the Black pastor, it's not the Black doctor, it's the sex worker, it's the drug dealer, it's the kid who just can't get right, it's every single Black life. And just naming it in not a convincing manner, right? So people have this twisted that Black Lives Matter is this call to action, it's this thing that make people pull into the streets, and literally Black Lives Matter is just an affirmation to Black people. Literally, that's all that it is an affirmation that your life matters, that I see you, I love you. And so the work that we're doing in regards to healing, which is extremely essential to getting any form of justice, is healing yourself to get to a point where you can call for justice. We're doing such dynamic, transformative work in this movement, and we're willing to build, and we're willing to take on strategies, and we're doing it in such a way that is with a deep analysis of a larger picture, and still taking care of ourselves in that. So for me, and I always say that, without my community, I could not exist. Without my community, I could not do this work. Without small wins, large wins, this work would not be sustainable. I would not be able to sustain myself and my spirit without the continuous dedication. Angela Davis recently said this at her talk at Union, that the identity of being Black is the continuous dedication to being in this struggle. That is the definition of being Black, is a continuous dedication to being in this struggle. So when you hear us say what is now a Asada's chant, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. How much more basic and passionate can you be than just knowing that notion, to wearing it on your back, to hear people shout it to the point where their voices get lost? And everybody hearing that cry, and then at the same time being somewhere in Cleveland, Ohio, and folks bursting out with Kendrick Lamar like, we gonna be all right, and it being an anthem that now every single body knows and believes in, it's because of the sacredness of being Black.
Okay, well, I think that, I don't know if, where are my timekeepers here? Where are we? Yeah, I feel like that is an amazing place to end. And I thank you for your time and attention as an audience. And I really want to thank this panel for your deep engagement. Thank you so much.